Okay, so hello and welcome back. So, last time we left off on the Battle of Wagram, in which Napoleon was able to defeat the Austrians after basically losing to a tactical defeat. So, if you haven't seen that video, then click up here. There should be a little card that's going to pop up, and then I'll take you to the playlist, and I highly suggest you catch up there. Otherwise, we're going to be reacting to Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer, so Spain 1809 to 1811. So, without further ado, the video is in the description, the original video. Go give them a like. Otherwise, let us continue. This war was my downfall, Napoleon Bonaparte, and it is one of the things that will bring him down. This and Russia, the two most ones, and also the attrition that will take place over the many wars that he's already been fighting.
In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power. He had just won another crushing victory against Austria at Wagram, and imposed a humiliating peace treaty. But the war he'd started in Spain and Portugal, with his ill-judged invasion the previous year, continued to rage. Napoleon had placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, uniting a proud country against him. His troops had dealt ruthlessly with popular uprisings, while routing a succession of Spanish armies. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes overcame the heroic defence of Zaragoza in a brutal siege that cost 54,000 Spanish lives and 10,000 French. But still, the Spanish and Portuguese remained defiant.
So that's 50,000 compared to around 10,000. That either means they slaughter civilians, which they may have done, and they said casualties, so I'm assuming this is a military target. So that means the defenders were probably very bad, or like not very well trained in the French war. I mean, you don't get casualty numbers like that unless you absolutely have tactical superiority in every single way.
And 3 months after their escape from Coruña, the British were back. In April, Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Lisbon to lead a small Anglo-Portuguese army. British redcoats would fight alongside Portuguese troops, who, with the help of British training, would soon prove themselves highly effective.
So let's just take a look to remember that the British, Marshal Soult was able to drive the British out, maybe near Porto, but I'm not really sure. I think it was up here more likely. Carmion, actually, no, this is it. So they're able to drive them off, but the British were able to get the BEF out of there. They were not under the command of Wellesley. They were under the command of another general that died in the field after getting everyone evacuated. Then they went to basically the Flanders region and landed in the Netherlands, and that went very fucking poorly. They might still be up there, but I don't think so. I think they withdrew into Britain, and now they're launching another expedition into the Iberian Peninsula, this time to Spain to liberate it, because they are allies. Portugal and the United Kingdom have been allies a very long time, I believe since the 14 or 1500s. Not exactly sure on that date, but they've been allies a very long time.
3 weeks after arriving in Portugal, Wellesley moved against Marshal Soult's Second Corps, which had recently taken Porto. Soult and his troops, preoccupied with plundering the region, had no warning of the British advance, and were soon in headlong retreat, back through the mountains into Spain.
Spain is a country where small armies are defeated and large armies starve. Henry IV of France, okay? He is not technically wrong here. What he is saying is that small armies, get beat by the big guys, but large armies starve to death because Spain is a very rugged place. A lot of mountains, a lot of hills. There was actually some desert there, and it's very arid if you just look at a geography map. So there's not a lot of food for a big army to take. Usually in this time period, foraging was the standard norm. You could get supply lines very slowly, but foraging was the norm, and also taking from the surrounding countryside. If the surrounding countryside doesn't have that much food, and you have a big army, well, you're kind of out of food.
Having secured Portugal for the time being, Wellesley planned a joint campaign with General Cuesta, commanding the Spanish army of Extremadura. On the 10th of July, the two commanders met at Casas de Miravete to discuss strategy. Relations between these two allies were not straightforward. Spain and Britain had a long history of conflict. The Spanish were deeply suspicious of British intentions in Spain, while the British had a low opinion of the Spanish army, which they considered poorly trained and badly led. Wellesley's
Both are not wrong. Last time, if I remember correctly, Spain had been to war with Britain, technically, um, right before the Napoleonic Wars. So they technically fought in the American Revolution. Again, that was a worldwide conflict called the 7 Years' War. Also, the 7 Years' War. So that dash, the French and Indian War, was against Prussia, a lot of countries in Europe. Okay, then the American Revolution happens, and that was also fought over the entire world. Spain was one of the people that also fought Britain to kick their ass to basically get prestige back, just like France did. Now, the part where the British did not look very highly on the Spanish army, we've seen the Spanish army in action. It sometimes wins, and sometimes it doesn't do very well. And they are still using the army system. They're not even at the core system, I don't believe yet. So they have improvements to make.
Request to take over command of Spanish forces was rejected, but the generals agreed to a joint advance up the Tagus Valley towards Madrid, to be supported by General Venegas, advancing from La Mancha.
So this idea of the British wanted to put the Spanish under their command, and the Spanish said, no, that will be a continuous issue to even today, less so today with NATO, a lot less so. World War One, everyone wanted to fight under their command, and they said, why would we fight under anyone else's command? That's stupid. Didn't even entertain the idea. World War II comes around. The exact same thing happens. The U.S. and the British are starting to mingle with the idea of at least letting the British have the admiralty, at least the British Navy, British admirals command in the Atlantic, and the Americans would command in the Pacific. And then the American ground forces would command in certain areas, and British ones would be under certain areas. So, like, the overall generals would be either a British or an American one, and then their generals would be either American or British. But that led to problems, obviously. But this idea of putting people under another country or another nationalities is a very foreign concept. Even today, if you try to put a French unit under German leadership, it doesn't work out very well. It can be done, it's just a lot of contentious issues.
In the face of their advance, Marshal Victor's First Corps withdrew to Talavera, where he was joined by King Joseph and General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French plan was for Joseph's army to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult led 3 corps down from the north to get behind and trap the Anglo-Spanish forces. But Joseph, worried by Soult's slow progress and General Venegas's advance on Madrid, decided to attack at Talavera.
You may ask why he would do something like this. It's because Madrid is going to be taken. Once Madrid's taken, he doesn't have a lot of options left. He either retreats or dies, because there's not another major supply route really anywhere, and Madrid's the capital. And he is right, Soult is moving pretty slow. So he is forced to attack. The plan is good to cut them off and then force an engagement. That would be on the French terms, but really this engagement is going to be on the British terms because they're being attacked. So
at Talavera.
$30,000 British troops, some 150 leagues from the sea, against 100,000 of the best troops in the world. My God. So Napoleon Bonaparte, basically scouting that he's going to absolutely crush them, or how they absolutely destroy the French army here. Now, 150 leagues, if I remember correctly, a league is roughly 6 feet. There is a very different measurement system. That is actually something we got out of we got the Napoleonic Code for the legal system, and Napoleon, I think, actually standardized on the metric system. So we actually know what measurements are, but that's a whole different issue I could get into later. But basically, measurements before we got to the metric system were whatever the fucking king wanted, really. this is 6 foot. Well, this is now 6 foot. And then again, it would be like literally a piece of rope that would go around to like each. This is a medieval kind of history, but this would be a piece of rope that would go around to different cities and be like, this is 6 foot. And you're like, huh, I guess that's 6 foot. And then people would shrink it and all that shit. So.
The Battle of Talavera saw British infantry bear the brunt of the French assault. They stood firm and repelled the enemy with disciplined musket fire and bayonet charges. Talavera was a small battle compared to the great clashes fought that year in Austria, but it proved that under Wellesley, Britain's small, well-drilled army was a force to be reckoned with.
That's actually roughly similar casualty numbers, slightly in their favor of the defender, which it should be more technically. But.
Even though in the short term, victory achieved little. Warned of Soult's approach from captured dispatches, the victorious Anglo-Spanish army retreated, while King Joseph and Fourth Corps marched against Venegas's army, which they smashed at the Battle of Almonacid. That autumn, the Supreme Junta in Seville, Free Spain's effective government, raised 2 new armies for another attempt to liberate Madrid, planning to converge on the capital from north and south.
Military junta, by the way, is just all the high-ranking officers are basically in charge, and they have a committee, more or less, to decide how everything is done. Kind of like a democracy, except only officers get to vote, and only the top guys get to vote, so...
But Wellesley, ennobled as Viscount Wellington for his victory at Talavera, had been so disgusted by the lack of Spanish cooperation that summer that he refused to risk his army. Predictably,
that tells you something. So he is not willing to stick his neck out at all for his supposed ally, which is the Spanish. Now, when you get to that, there's a lot of factors that have to get to that point, which is basically the Spanish don't know what the fuck they're doing. The officers, not the men. And they're just moping around and doing whatever the fuck. As you saw, Joseph was able to smash that fucking army into pieces. And what's probably going to happen is more Spanish armies get destroyed. But if you don't have the level of trust with your allies, that's it. It's over. Because you can't coordinate. You can't be like, I'm going to take that position when you're unsure if your right flank will ever be covered, and then you're cut off and you'll die. So
Spain's inexperienced armies met with disaster. At Ocaña, they suffered their biggest defeat of the war, when a smaller force under Marshal Soult routed the Spanish army, taking 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannon. A week later, the army of the left was heavily defeated at Alba de Tormes. There was more bad news when Girona fell to the French after an epic 7-month siege. The Supreme Junta's plans to retake Madrid were in tatters, and southern Spain was now wide open to French attack.
Yeah, they've got nobody left at this point. They just failed it 3 times in a row, basically. So. My objective is to not obtain submission by force, but to dispel illusions. I will arrive at a union of hearts. Joseph Bonaparte.
In January 1810, King Joseph marched south with an army of 60,000 men. Spanish resistance evaporated. Spain's Supreme Junta was overthrown in a coup, as Córdoba and Sevilla fell without a fight.
You can see why Wellesley was saying that the Spanish armies are not very good and are not exactly holding up very well.
Joseph, who still hoped to win over the Spanish with his progressive reforms, was welcomed by many as a savior from anarchy. Only Cadiz held out, its defences reinforced by a British naval squadron, and was besieged by Victor's First Corps. Meanwhile, Napoleon sent Marshal Massena to Spain with 65,000 reinforcements. He was reckoned one of Napoleon's best marshals, and had just been made Prince of Essling for his heroics in the recent war against Austria.
So those titles that they've been talking about, like the Viscount of, well, the thing's gone, but the Viscount, which was awarded to Wellington, and then as Massena, the Prince of X, is technically just a title. It does not. It doesn't come with any actual fiefdoms. So one, it's any land. It's just a title of honor, basically. So like you were honored for your participation in X, and you were so good in that we're going to give you a title that is honorary. So,
Massena
which, if you think about it, since medals didn't really exist, that was the medal system back then.
was to lead a third French invasion of Portugal, take Lisbon and chase the British back into the sea. He laid siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, a fortified city controlling one of the main routes into Portugal, which surrendered after 2 weeks' bombardment.
That is so. If you follow, so basically, if you ever are curious, follow the roads and follow the railways. That is why people go to certain positions. So as you can see, this is the main road or the main MSR, main supply route. And you can see that they have to control these. So there will be battles up and down these corridors because it's very easy to get supply here. And going into the mountains, it's almost extremely impossible. So that's why main battles should be fought around, main supply areas. If you look at anywhere, for the example, the American Civil War, you may ask, like, why didn't they go X, Y, and Z? And it's like, well, they had roads and railways up and down these areas, so that's why they're defending.
Wellington, with only 33,000 men to face Massena's 50,000, retreated. Massena crossed the Portuguese frontier and besieged Almeida. After just 13 hours of bombardment, a lucky French shot hit the Portuguese magazine. 70 tons of gunpowder went up in a devastating explosion that made all further resistance useless.
Yeah, so a magazine explosion, that is a very lucky hit. Basically, they hit the powder store building, whatever it was, in this siege of this city or town. And when they hit that whole thing goes up. 70 tons of explosive power go off. So there is no more ammo anymore. Any ammo you have on you is the only ones you have left. And that probably destroyed and totaled food supply, medical supply, people, buildings, everything is gone. So 13-hour siege, yeah.
Useless. It was a serious blow to Wellington, who'd been relying on Almeida's strong defences to buy him time.
And that is not something he could have predicted. 13 hours in a magazine explosion to take a city/town is... You can't really think, you can't plan around that. You're like, oh yes, they will lose it in 13 hours. No. Usually a siege lasts for at least a couple of days. Minimums usually are weeks, if not months. So he thought he had time to keep pulling out. But turns out, no.
At Busaco, he found a strong defensive position and made a stand.
So when you are able to choose the ground that you're going to fight on, so they're coming to him, but they also outnumber him, almost 2-1, which is what you need to be an attacking force, usually. Maybe 3-1 if you want to be better. But you are able to fight on your own ground, and this army he is leading is not that big, but it is very professionalized and has pretty good soldiers and discipline, okay? So this force can probably beat them off, if not stall them off, especially if they're fighting on good ground and they have the training. So they got 2 of those.
Massena's uphill frontal attack failed, at a cost of 4,000 casualties. But the next day, the French found a way to outflank Wellington's position, and his retreat continued.
So probably what happened there, because again, you only have so many troops, you can only stretch your lines so far. So if the French are able to find a route that can get around you, they can prepare to do a feint attack to your front and send around, a couple thousand more guys around on your right flank, and you either abandon your position because you're going to get flanked. You really have to abandon your position. You're not going to do much else. I mean, you could sit there and die, but...
As Massena's army neared Lisbon, his scouts reported something completely unexpected. Stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula, protecting the city from attack, they found a new chain of fortifications in 2 major lines. Known as the Lines of Torres Vedras, the British and Portuguese had been constructing these defences for more than a year. Now the lines bristled with more than 100 forts, redoubts and batteries, manned by 30,000 troops and 250 guns.
Now, this is Lisbon. This is the capital. So again, the capital it has access to the sea, and the French don't really have a fucking navy to contend this. So that means the city and these guys can be continuously supplied. MacArthur will actually have a strategy like this to defend the Philippines. How he executed it many factors, including himself, bungled the fucking thing. But the strategy was similar. Pull back to a defensive area that is very defensive that you can be resupplied or have a massive stockpile of supplies at, and you can hold out for a very long time. MacArthur tried to do this. He fucked that up for other reasons. But this is a very good defensive position. Now, Marshal Marmont is, I mean, it's going to take him a while to punch through these defenses if he even wants to do that. And also, Wellington has reinforced the already 30,000 people here. So there's 60,000 defenders now, including on defensive positions, including not just defensive positions, but they're also fortifications.
Massena soon discovered the lines were far too strong for him to attack. What's more, a scorched earth strategy had stripped the surrounding countryside of anything that might help the French.
A scorched earth policy, if you don't understand that, scorched earth policy means you take absolutely everything from the countryside. So examples, if you're going to do a scorched earth policy, you're going to burn all the farms down, take all the food with you, or burn all the food and leave nothing for your pursuer or the attacker with. And it's exactly what they did. So the French are basically out here with really the food they brought with them, and maybe the supply lines if they hold up. Otherwise, there is no food out here. You can't forage.
While Portuguese partisans attacked French supply columns as they struggled through the mountains to reach Massena's army.
And when you do that, Massena is going to start starving to death if he doesn't do something.
Massena faced a grim predicament. Starved of supplies, too weak to attack, unwilling to retreat. But throughout this standoff, it was Portuguese peasants who suffered most of all. When their villages and farms were burned, many took refuge in Lisbon, where thousands died of starvation and disease.
So, Prince of Essling, you are no longer Massena. Napoleon to Marshal Massena. So, what that means is, so Prince, you are no longer the marshal that you once were, which is a scathing comment by Napoleon.
Back in France, Napoleon had been preoccupied with his divorce from the Empress Josephine, and then a new marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was now expecting their first child.
I don't know his love story with that, but again, different politics. Politics from the nobility are different from regular people. So, Napoleon is going to marry the daughter of the Austrian emperor. What this is going to do is solidify that they have an alliance together, technically, because they are now bound by blood, which is, I mean, an alliance is an alliance, right? But an alliance in blood, especially during this time period, is much, much, much stronger.
Nevertheless, from Paris, Napoleon sent frequent orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal, urging them to take more aggressive action. But when these orders arrived weeks later, they were usually out of date and showed little understanding of the problems his marshals faced.
Yeah, so again, this is going to be a constant up till World War II, and even really during World War II was still a problem. But information, if you send a horse rider from Paris, it's going to take him weeks to get to Spain. And when he's like, "Hey, I need you to attack this position," and you get to Spain, and they're like, "Well, we don't actually have any troops there anymore because like 2 weeks ago they got pushed back." So again, the orders are you can't use them. I mean, you're so far out of touch. I mean, you just don't have the information on your hands to actually coordinate anything when you're that far away.
He now ordered Soult, based in Andalusia, to go on the offensive to draw enemy forces away from Lisbon, so Massena could take the city. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city that controlled the southern route into Portugal.
So as you can see, this is also the other main supply route. So he's trying to get Wellington to come out of his box box position and come help the Spanish, because the Spanish will be crying that they need some support. And if they don't get the support, well, then they're going to start losing whatever they have left. It's a decent strategy if Wellington will move.
When 12,000 men of the army of Extremadura marched to its relief, they were routed by Soult, after which the city tamely surrendered, giving up 8,000 prisoners and vast quantities of stores.
Yeah, so the Spanish have not been doing well for the past few years, really at all.
It was another heavy blow to Spain's armed forces. But remarkably, despite such disasters and their many blundering generals, the Spanish troops remained willing to fight, the courage of the rank and file undimmed.
Which is an important distinction to make, just like the Battle of France, okay? The officer corps can let you down, but the men fighting, their morale like high, because I mean this is their country, right? The regular rank and file, which is just the everyday man, is like, okay, but yeah, we've lost, but we're gonna keep fighting. Well, the officers are fucking panicking and losing their minds and shit.
Victor's First Corps, besieging Cadiz, had now been so weakened to support other operations that the Anglo-Spanish garrison decided to attack. The Allies landed along the coast to strike at the French siege lines from the rear.
So usually that's called sallying out. So when you sally out from a defensive siege, basically, to attack your besieger. And if they're that weak, you can break the siege and, not be starving and not be under siege anymore.
But they were ambushed by the French at Barossa. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought off the enemy, but a furious falling out between British commander Sir Thomas Graham and his Spanish counterpart General La Peña threw away any advantage. Soult, alarmed at these developments, marched back to Andalusia.
And you can see, again, the coordination between two different countries' armed forces is very hard, and you can see what happens when you don't do it very well.
Meanwhile, Massena, out of food and with no prospect of reinforcement, had no option but to retreat. Wellington's army pursued, discovering evidence of several appalling atrocities committed by the French against Portuguese villagers.
Now that Wellington, so basically Massena ran out of food. He ran out of time. He had a time limit and he ran out of time. So he's pulling back. Now Wellington can go pursue him and leave the defensive works there so he can come back there if he needs to. But now he can start striking out into Spain and start pursuing Massena, because Massena's out of supplies. So
There were running battles with the French rearguard, brilliantly commanded by Marshal Ney, until he was sacked by Massena for criticizing his leadership.
Okay, so Ney is the heart of the French army. Okay, it's the heart of the French military, really. He is a very good cavalry commander. He is a very good corps commander if directed and told what to do. He is fearless, and any men under him basically don't break. So when he questions Massena, which he will do, he also questions Napoleon. He'll question everyone. Like, what the fuck are you doing? And Massena sacks him. Well, you kind of lost one of your best morale instruments that you did have. Sacked means fired.
Having chased the French out of Portugal, Wellington besieged Almeida. Massena's army, now rested and reinforced, marched to its aid. The two armies clashed again at Fuentes de Oñoro. In 2 days of heavy fighting, Massena failed to break through Wellington's position to relieve Almeida. The fortress fell the next week, but to Wellington's fury, British bungling allowed most of the French garrison to escape. Massena had lost 25,000 men in Portugal. Now he'd lost Almeida too, and a string of bad decisions, not least to bring his mistress with him on campaign, had cost him the respect of his officers.
Yeah, I'll bring my mistress with me while I'm at it. Yeah, so your officers don't trust you anymore. Your men are like, well, you just fired our fucking hero, Marshal Ney. Yeah, Massena's out. I can see that from here. He's fucked. His officers don't like him and don't trust him anymore. The men don't trust him, and he's lost consistently. He's out.
The Marshal, whom Napoleon had once nicknamed the Dear Child of Victory, was recalled to France in disgrace, never to hold senior command again.
So
Napoleon
that means he's out, out, out. Not just out, out. Not just out. That means he's out, out. So sometimes the Americans in World War II would sack generals for minor things, but they would be given command again, eventually somewhere. But this means he's out, out. So like he fucked up so bad that he will never take command of anything ever again. Even when in 1814 and 1815, when France is literally under attack, they won't give him command of shit again. So he's done.
sent Marshal Marmont to replace him. Meanwhile, Marshal Beresford, the British commander of Portugal's army, was sent to retake Badajoz with 20,000 British and Portuguese troops.
Now that is a combination that actually might work. They're under British command, but they also have British and Portuguese, so maybe their coordination would be better because they technically have been allies for a long time, unlike Spain.
When Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera.
Now, one of the reasons he would do that is because if the defenders of the siege don't know that they're being relieved, which they probably don't, Bedford is doing something very smart here. He's going to defeat and detail that army. So he can't take Soult and the garrison when they combine, right? They outnumber him. But if he can defeat Soult in the field and then go back and siege them out, then he can defeat Soult on equal terms, go back and siege them out, and they will give up, or they will take the siege. Will be a lot easier to do.
It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Around 6,000 casualties on each side, with more than a third of the British infantry killed, wounded, or captured.
Now you may be curious, like, if this is real, and yes, the drummer boys, so technically they weren't supposed to be shot at, but shit happens. And yeah, they would be very young. They wouldn't be adults, and basically their whole thing was to do the drums and inspire the drums to keep the men marching at a certain pace and relay orders and such. Now, they were in the front, so when they got shot at, I mean, gonna get hit and probably die. But that's just par normal for this era of warfare that we are at. But they would never be given a musket to fight in the line, let's put it that way. They weren't that old, and they weren't able to hold such. Long story short, they don't give them guns, they give them drums, but they're still in the front, so.
Marshal Soult declared,
"There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I'm sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine. But they didn't know how to run."
Soult had
But they didn't know how to run. So basically, he said he was kicking their ass the entire time, but they refused to run. So, I mean, when people refuse to run, very good discipline and morale can win you the day.
been checked, but he was determined to save Badajoz.
Also, it ended kind of in a draw-ish, it seems like, because they're not completely destroyed, so.
The newly arrived Marshal Marmont marched to his aid, and they advanced again. This combined army forced the British to abandon the siege. But when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, Soult and Marmont did not pursue. French commanders in Spain had learned grudging respect for Wellington and for the steadiness of his troops.
Basically, Wellington picked a very good defensive position, and he wanted Marmont and Soult to attack him because he knew he could probably take them there. But they knew that his men were very well disciplined, and fighting Wellington on a defensive ground, which he will do numerous times, you're probably not going to win. Wellington may not be the best offensive general there is, but he certainly is one of the best defensive generals that existed during this time period.
For now, the war in Spain had entered stalemate.
Spain, general's fortune, officers run, soldiers death. French barracks graffiti, so, shit that was drawn on the barracks. Now, this is very funny to me because it's all true. Spain, general's fortune. So as we've seen, generals will make out with enormous amounts of wealth. They will steal everything from their regions and send it back to France to make themselves enormously rich. Officers ruin. these officers, lower ranking officers, and including the generals, it will meet with their damnation and resignation of their command because they can't win. And soldiers' death because everyone that's going over there is dying from the French. So, yeah, you will die there.
While British, French and Spanish armies crisscrossed Spain and Portugal, another war was fought every day in the mountains, hills and woods. From 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, militias and ex-soldiers began taking up arms against the hated French invader. They waged a war of ambushes and hit-and-run raids, known in Spanish as La Guerrilla, the Little War. Its fighters became known in English as guerrillas.
This is where we actually get the term guerrilla warfare and fighting as guerrillas and guerrillas. This is the war that comes from.
Britain's Royal Navy supplied vital weapons, stores and money, often landing them behind enemy lines.
So basically a modern day insurgency. Like insurgency back then, but they didn't use that term, right? But they're basically doing it. What we would call today an insurgency.
Much of Spain's rugged countryside fell under the control of the guerrillas. North of Madrid, Juan Martín Díez, an ex-soldier known as El Empecinado, the Stubborn, led a guerrilla band 6,000 strong. In Navarre, Espoz y Mina, a former peasant, ran a highly organised band that caused havoc for the French, capturing convoys and couriers on the strategic Burgos-Bayonne road.
And this road is the main MSR into Spain from France. So when you sit here and you intercept couriers, supplies, weapons, troops that are not that are just being used as reinforcements, you can really hamper a supply line like this.
And branding Viva Mina on the forehead of collaborators. While in the west, Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, led the self-styled Lanceros de Castilla. El Charro himself wore a French hussar's cap, its eagle symbolically turned upside down.
Now, you need to remember something. These three guys, they're not working with each other. Actually, they'll probably fucking fight each other. The Spanish guerrillas, really, their only aim that they may have in common is to liberate Spain. Everything else, though, they're not under any army command, let's put it that way.
There were dozens more bands operating across Spain, though a few were no better than bandits, terrorizing civilians as often as the enemy. The guerrilla war was merciless, marked by hideous atrocities on both sides. A French soldier's greatest fear was to be taken alive by the guerrillas, who often tortured their prisoners before killing them. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down by this people's war, guarding outposts or patrolling the countryside.
And again, all these troops can't be used for major field engagements because they have to stay in their regions to patrol and subdue the guerrillas.
The roads were so dangerous for French messengers that they required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more.
That's insane.
Many still didn't get through, their valuable dispatches forwarded to Wellington, for whom they became an invaluable source of intelligence.
So these couriers, if you don't know, they're basically just carrying messages from generals or Napoleon up and down Spain. And when you intercept them, you know what the enemy is planning and doing. So, and also a 200-man bodyguard for a courier is fucking insane because usually couriers only go in by themselves and maybe a few men. So
the war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers. As was typical in wars of this era, most died from disease, but more died fighting guerrillas than in battle against the British and Spanish armies.
So let's take a look at these numbers. That's pretty fucking insane. So 240,000 is a massive amount of people to die. This is soldiers killed, not casualties. These are killed. So the casualty number is probably in the millions. But again, sickness, accidents, and other causes. So basically, sickness and disease will kill more soldiers all the way up to past World War I. World War II was like the first major war that doesn't happen. But yeah, basically no antibiotics. I mean, you already know the world's not very good without antibiotics. And the guerrilla war is actually going to take more French soldiers' lives than in battle. Think about that. The insurgency itself killed more French soldiers than died in battle. Spain is one of the factors that will bring down the French Empire and Napoleon, especially because of the amount of people that will die in Spain that are from his army. Again, 240,000 dead. These 240,000 people didn't really need to die if he didn't attack Spain. But again, that's alternate history.
However, it was the twin threat, a well-led regular army under Wellington and a popular insurgency, that left the French facing an impossible strategic dilemma.
And he's right there. If one of the two things didn't happen, Spain was going to turn out differently. Either if the British had no guys down there and there was no actual armies, the guerrilla warfare can probably be won. If Wellington is out there with the Spanish and the Portuguese troops and they have no guerrillas, the French will probably be able to beat them in the field. But these two factors combined utterly destroy any French army in Spain.
If their armies remained dispersed to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could attack. But if they concentrated to defeat Wellington in battle, huge swathes of the country would quickly fall to the guerrillas. This was Napoleon's Vietnam.
Yeah, it's this impossible dilemma. Because, again, if they go to Madrid and they spread out in the countryside, that means if that Wellington marches up to Madrid, they don't have an army. They have guys that are scattered, and it'll take time to gather to fight them off. But if they gather, then the guerrillas are going to run rampaging around. And yes, it is Napoleon's basically Vietnam.
Or his bleeding ulcer, as he called it. A war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties every day, with little prospect of victory. And in 1812, as Napoleon launched his gigantic invasion of Russia, Wellington and the guerrillas launched their own offensive that would turn the war in Spain on its head.
Which makes sense, right? If you take a look here, Napoleon's going to got all of his best dudes up in Russia that he's about to go attack. And then Wellington knows that if Napoleon's out here in Russia, he can't send reinforcements to Spain. So if he launch an all-out attack on Spain, the French can't have any reinforcements. They don't have any more. They can't really get supplies out. So yeah, this is the perfect time to launch your offensive. So hope you guys enjoyed that video. Again, if you like this type of stuff, give me a like and subscribe. Otherwise, up on there should be a playlist if you want to go check out more of the videos from Epic History TV that I reacted to. Otherwise, I'll see people later.